Welcome back to a new episode on the Truth That Heals podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anthony Hernandez, and today we have a very special guest. We have Vennie Kocsis, who is also a cult survivor and who has written a few books, one on the way, and one, as you can see in the background, is Cult Child. Welcome to the show, Vennie. Thank you for
Thank
joining us.
you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So it's been probably a year now that I've been engaging with you through
Yeah.
Twitter, social media, and I find personally social media has been able to help me connect with other survivors, and that's helped me in my own healing journey. And that's how I got connected with you through social media.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you. Same for me. I mean, without social media, oh my gosh, I don't even think I would have met like fellow survivors from the exact cult I was in. So I'm grateful too.
Well,
Yeah.
well, there's something funny about social media because, yes, while it does help me to connect with other survivors, other people who are looking to heal, I have also encountered people who are full of toxicity. Um, During your years of uh, finding yourself and reaching out through, writing your book, and you've created your voice, you have your voice. Have you encountered people who are toxic on the social media platforms, and how do you deal with them?
Well, I mean, I'm in my 50s. I just turned 55. And so I'm one of those Gen Xers that made that transition to no media to the internet. So social media started out toxic. It was extremely toxic with in a lot of very dark places. And I've probably been toxic a time or a few myself. I stand on no pedestal. It's funny, I was just actually talking with a psychologist online about this because there is something with cult survivors. We hate to see grifting and lying. Like that to me is really tough. I can stand the trolls. Like
Mhm.
it's when I see predatory behavior, it's very hard for me. And so I was having a conversation like, what is that triggering in myself? What is causing me to have an emotion about that specifically? Um, so my way of dealing with them is that I don't. I block them. I have very few people blocked. The three people I have blocked are blocked for a reason, because of that reason, because they're predatory. So I just think it's best like don't feed the fire, let it snuff itself out, take a break. Don't, we're none of us are exempt from emotion, right? From seeing something or reading something. But the great thing about Facebook and X both is that you have the ability to train it and tell it what you don't want to see, and it listens. So I've really, really done that with X. I don't get a lot of toxicity in my feed because I've trained it. So I think it's important to know like the algorithm and how to use it and how to train social media from a technological standpoint to keep your mental health safe.
And I'm really thankful that you brought that up about blocking it out. Even though you've only blocked three people, you're able to have your boundaries and know where you stand and not allow it to destroy your day. But sadly, when people leave a cult, sometimes social media is their first way of connection. So I really wanted to start this interview from there because there are, survivors like me who had nowhere to go. And for the first few months, it was scary because trying
Yeah.
to engage, there is this toxicity, and then there are people like you who are, I would say, a safe space to,
Thank you.
to
Thank
be
you. It means
around.
a lot. Thank
But
you.
but I'd imagine, and you mentioned not that long ago that it's also taken you a journey. I would like to get to understand what has your journey been like? What has your transformation been like? And to kind of start, what was the cult like life? And maybe we can go through the name of the cult that you were in.
Okay. The cult I was in is called Sam Fife's Move of God. So if you go to Wikipedia, put in Sam Fife's Move of God, People can read about it. You can also go to my website, venniekocsis.com/the cult. And I've got tons of documents. He was an evangelical preacher. He believed that you are born as a beast and that you must, cleanse yourself of that and become into the likeness of God. He definitely preached the end times. He believed in demonology. So anything that you had that was behavioral, drug addiction, if you were gay, if you were a pedophile, all of that could be healed through exorcism. And so they believed it down to Down syndrome, seizure disorders. So you've got a lot of very young children going through some very violent exorcisms under the guise of faith healing. Uh, the first compound I was on, I was separated from my mother. My mother was overweight, and so that meant she had a demon of gluttony. And as soon as we got there, they immediately put her into sleep deprivation. Like she later told me that she remembered the first night she was there, they kept her up praying. It was like you need to go through this cleansing ritual to get ready, but really it was dissecting her mind so she couldn't think for herself. So there was a lot of really intense violence there, and I won't go into detail. And I was there until I was 7 years old, so 4 years. And then they moved us all up to Alaska, where they were homesteading land. Um, uh, the Alaska pipeline was about to pay out dividends starting in 1981. And so they mass moved a lot of us up there between 77 and 78. So we could get that year of residency and they could cash in on us when those pipeline dividends hit. And they did. And they moved hundreds of us up there. There were 5 compounds. We lived with no running water or electricity, very limited schooling. Um, Excruciating work days from sunup to sundown, beaten if you didn't work. Basically slavery. If you really want to be as blunt about it as possible, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, cannot think for yourself, cannot express yourself, complete fear from morning to night. And so that's how I lived day in and day out in Alaska until I was 14. And a situation happened with my sister and it got us banished. And then I moved out into the world. So that's a very compacted, brief um, summary of what's in this book.
Okay. You mentioned about how they would cash in for all the residents who were there on the compound in Alaska.
Right.
Were those families, were they allowed to keep that money for themselves and to,
No.
so where did that money go? To the leadership?
Where did it go? I'd love to know. It's one
Yeah.
of my questions. Where'd all my child support go that my father was ordered to, right? So it was a very, I guess, somewhat kind of a mixture of communism and socialism, if you think about it. Communism in that they're like completely dictating to you everything about what you wear, what you say, what you're allowed to read, 100% censorship. Um, Sometimes stupidly. Here's an example of that. We get a National Geographic in that we're going to use maybe for a history class or whatever limited reason. There's a tribe in there, they're bare breasted, they cut that out. So like it's just like idiotic stuff like that. They taught us about backmasking, that secular music had hidden demonic messages in it. um so yeah, I hope I'm answering your question, but it was a little bit of that. And then they took everything under the guise that, right, you get free room and board, you
Yeah,
get
but
free
it's,
food, but you got to work for it and you
yeah.
got to prepare it. And yeah.
Another thing that you mentioned, which caught my attention, is a bit of the theology of Sem 5 from what I've just heard from you, that when you're born, you are born a beast. Is that correct?
Hmm. Born into sin.
You're born into sin and you're born a beast. Now, for
Mhm.
Sam 5, did you know him personally by chance?
Well, he traveled around and preached. So we would see him at conventions. It was very Like, imagine if a celebrity and their entourage was going to come and visit your home, what
Mhm.
you might do, the cleaning, the
Of
preparing,
course, yeah.
right? It was that type of energy when him and the Father Ministry, which were his chosen apostles, would come to the farms. A lot of, like, a month you would be preparing for them. And they would all sit at their own table, and special food was made on that day. Maybe you might get like cakes or something. You know what I mean? The best meats are brought
Mhm.
out, things like that.
So for the leadership, well, of course, Sam Five, he's the founder or creator of this group. Were there other people in charge alongside with him, or was it?
Yeah. So each compound had a system of elders. I mean, not unlike your regular church that has bishops, right? And then the preacher. So, except there was no head preacher because Sam Fife was the head preacher.
Mm.
So the elders, which were primarily men, ran the compounds on a day-to-day basis, ran the business, the financial parts of it. This is where when people say, oh, this cult was started by a bunch of bums, and no, it wasn't. It was started by some very, very, very smart people who knew accounting, who somehow got tons of equipment and tons of money to buy equipment like horses that pulled plows, tractors, everything they would need for a sawmill, a lot of military blankets and clothing, and a lot of like military cots, Quonset huts, things like that. So it wasn't just started by some loser people. It was a very well thought out and planned operation. Um, on that link I gave earlier, VennieKocsis.com, the cults, there's a sermon entitled The Divine Order of Raising Children. If anybody wants to understand the depth of depravity that Sam Five taught about children, they merely need to read that sermon, where he even talks about trapping his own wife in a bathroom and beating her and just laughing and laughing as she writhed around as he was beating the demon out of her. I mean, he's just openly talking about horrific domestic violence. And in that sermon, he also instructs that you have to start punishing a baby at 3 days old because they're selfish, and they will wake mother up, and they will wake her up 12, 13 times a night with their own selfish needs. And so that's the depravity of what he taught. Not only were we children experiencing torture, we were having to witness it happening to other children as well. It was like just compounded trauma.
So did he preach only to the several compounds, or would he go to, uh, like, would he go in the street, or would he go to different churches? How
He
did that
started
work?
as a street preacher.
Okay.
That was like his very first, back in the 60s, I think, like the early 60s. He was in Miami preaching on the corner.
And that's how he
And
started recruiting.
mhm, yeah, and then he grew from there. And then I have a newspaper article from 1976, I think, out of California. And at that time, they said that the cult boasted about 43,000 followers. And then he expanded beyond the United States. He had compounds in South America, Ireland,
Oh,
New
wow.
Zealand. There's one right now in Kenya. I talked to someone who no longer is on the compound, and the same kind of disturbing stories of abuse. And yeah.
So from the very beginning, was it already, did it have a focus on justifying abuse, or was that something that came upon later on?
Well, in the recruitment process, I was a year old to 3 years old, right? So I have very few scattered memories, but I remember energy. I remember the way things felt around me in my environment as a toddler. And I remember some, like, it was more jovial, kind of how they recruit now to like come to our Bible study, or we're having Bible study in our home. Bring your kids, they'll all play and they have food and they make it fun,
Yeah.
right? But then I can just remember the energy of my mother turning sadder and darker and darker. She laughed less. She played with us less. She got more strict. Um, Slowly as they were like, oh, like for instance, my brother was left-handed. And so they eventually convinced her that that was demonic. They believed that being left-handed, the left-hand path, Lucifer,
Mhm.
so stupid. Anyways, that writing with your left hand was Lucifer. So you had to learn. And so it was those types of little things they would ingrain into her. Um, she had no idea. I highly doubt if they had in any way told her the level of torture that she and her children were about to endure. She would not have gone. So that you get tricked, you get lured, and then once you're there, now you're on a compound. You have limited access. Like you can't just go freely use a phone. You have to make an appointment with an elder who sits with you while you make that call. You see what I mean? Every part of your life. You can't trust anybody you have conversations with because you don't know if you say something wrong and they go to it's just continuously, you're always like that. I see this behavior on social media, this culture of silence where people see bad behavior and they're afraid to speak up. I've been afraid to speak up. Like, I don't want to deal with those stupid attacks, right?
Mhm.
But it's there. It's that same cultish behavior. That's what keeps them going is everybody is afraid. Joe Rogan said something once that really stood out to me. He said, you can commit an atrocious act in front of 100 people and nobody will do anything. But you do it in front of one, that one person will probably jump in. Because in the 100, everybody's waiting for everyone else to step forward, and then nobody ever does. And so it's that. It was that culture of just straight fear. But when you put someone directly into sleep deprivation, within 24, have you ever stayed up more than 24 hours in your life?
It's
You know how
terrifying.
your mind starts to just get foggy, even
Mhm.
in just a normal situation. Like, say you've worked a double, right?
Yeah.
Your life's okay, you've worked a double, and still you're like, God, you can't get this critical thinking. So, like, imagine that, add on prayer, and now reading Bible verses, and all of that on top of being awake. And that's what they did to my mom immediately. And so that's it. They've got your mind. I mean, I it's these behaviors that kind of stem from war. So that's what they do to POWs.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's where some of these sick behaviors are learned. Holding us in ice baths, that's torture. And that's the type of stuff that's done to prisoners of war. And so that's the level of that's why I don't hate my mom or blame her because she was a victim too.
And it makes me now curious because they recruited your mother, and you've stated how, once you're in the compound, you've been separated from your mom because she's supposedly she has the demon of gluttony. Is that correct?
Right. Seven
So,
deadly sins, right? The seven
yeah,
deadly sins: sloth, gluttony, envy, pride, whatever else. Yeah.
but now I'm wondering who else did they recruit? Did they recruit was everyone who was recruited to this compound a slave to a one of the deadly sins or
Yeah, no, yes. Okay. And also I just want to mention my father. So the way we even ended up in California is he was employed by Hughes Aircraft and he went to work on the F-14. So he's off in this project, gone for 6 weeks at a time. The woman who actually recruited my mother was one of his friend's wives.
Hmm.
So it wasn't like a stranger came into our life. It was somebody that my father thought he could trust. Um, and so then my mom just demanded a divorce. Or, well, she gave him an ultimatum because she really did believe the world was ending. After all, her husband was building a warplane, wasn't he? So there you go, rumors of war straight from the Bible. They've spit those verses. And that split them up. So we lost the protection, the male protection in our home. And back then, fathers didn't have rights. The cult paid for my mother's divorce. They asked my father, like, who's going to care for the children? You're off working. So naturally, they gave us to my mother. And he later told me he was allowed phone calls, but, I don't remember any of them, but my brother and sister did, and they were always monitored. But they had certain compounds that they called deliverance farms.
What is that?
That farm was specifically made for people who needed exorcism treatment. So there is a video that's on that same page, the cult. It's called the Jane tapes. So just giving you a little backstory of what Sam's whole goal was with this demonology shit. Is he was around Tulane University for a while. And he had a friend who was a clergyman, but also was like trained in psychology. He was able to get a job at Tulane. There was a lady named Jane Miller, and she, had mental health issues. And somehow they convinced through his little clergyman, which I later found this out because I found an unauthorized biography. And this guy did a forward, and I was like, oh my God, like you guys were undercover in Tulane trying to get Tulane University, which was like the top psychiatric hospital at the time, to accept exorcism as a viable treatment for mental health. And so they create this whole tape of Sam delivering these demons from her in the hopes to use that tape. So that was part of it too, was in a way you're like, damn, like were we,
Yeah.
was my mother part of this study? This, see, it works, but it wasn't working. You guys starved her. She got like a cup of food a day in 3 portions. So your exorcisms didn't work. Your starving helped her lose weight. But so yeah, so Ware, Massachusetts was a deliverance farm, and there was another one in Sapa, Mississippi, and there was another one in Blueberry, Canada. And then eventually into the late 70s, early 80s, they started like youth reforming as well. So I don't know if you've watched this most recent series on Netflix called The Project.
No.
It's excellent. And Dr. Yanya Lalich is on it, and I just love her. And she's always been the one cult expert that really cared about children, or at least I felt that she has. Um, but they started doing that type of stuff, sending the teenagers. I met one girl who talked about being in Immokalee, Florida, and how they made her run in 105-degree weather until she was vomiting and passing out. And I mean, just horrific stuff for little things. Little, you could get punished. You know how sometimes you're, like, say you're with your female friend and you're 8 years old and you guys kind of lock pinkies.
Yeah.
If you like, I'm using this as a hypothetical, something like that could get you accused of being gay at a very young age and get you severely tortured for it. So you had to watch everything you did, how you moved your body, how you touched other people, lest you be accused of doing something horrific like The Handmaid's Tale.
Mhm.
So it was that constricted. Um,
Was there,
yeah.
would you say that there was a lot of physical abuse?
Oh, torture.
Torture.
I would not. That is beyond abuse. Um, Torture.
And did Sam Five know about this, or was this like
He
done?
encouraged it. So again, going back to that one sermon about the divine order of raising children, he encouraged it. It's that whole kind of like, ideal and theology the Catholics use with the scourging. I've got to scourge myself for God, bloody my back. I am not worthy. It's that mentality put on children.
Like a guilt
You are
kind of,
not like what?
like a guilt. Because there's this thing of like it's called like Catholic guilt, where it's like you're never like enough, and
Yeah.
you always have to find some form of suffering to kind of
Hmm.
fill in the gaps.
Yes, with the ultimate goal that you will one day fill in all the gaps and become like God. One day you will make it there. Yeah. So putting that ideal on children, but it was beyond torture or beyond abuse. And it was torture, holding us in ice baths for hours. I had near death experiences as a child, and I write about these in my book. And I've had some therapy about this to try to understand it. Um, to watch that, to be a child and watch groups of adults ascend on another kid because they had like a system that they used too, where the first circle of people would lay their hands, and then another circle of people would lay their hands, and on it would go. And you're just in there, just smothered. It's hot. It's terrifying. It's loud. Everybody's speaking in tongues and screaming at you. Get out, devil, get out, those types of things. You're getting hit on the head. So there's what it might look like in a service. Then there's the times that we were punished just with a few elders, um, and being put in ice baths, being beaten with belts, um, just on and on and on. I'm trying not to be too graphic. I try to be a little sensitive to people who are listening because it's a lot. It's heavy. Uh, it's some of the most horrific abuse that children can go through, where it is torture. If anybody wants to understand a little bit, when I watched the recent case of Sandra Vander Ark, the things that she did to her child were so similar. The ice baths, the things like that. I was like really pinging on how similar that torture was. So it was things like that. And it was just for mere behaviors. I mean, it's not that you were a bad child. Like, how dare you laugh? That's a demon of silliness. You're being selfish. So don't laugh and play. We had no toys. We weren't allowed to play. We were kept busy every moment of the day because idle work was the devil's hands.
And for those who were doing this abuse, was it your parents who were told to, lead the way and discipline you, and then the rest of the community followed, or was it like the preacher who would do this?
Well, I mean, I wasn't the first kid there. There were already lots of kids at Ware, and most of them were separated from their parents because it was usually the parents that were there for whatever demon treatment they needed, to be at the deliverance farm. So I was separated from my mother. It was not my mother, it was other people. We had a main woman that was over my room. I was put with girls my age. So probably girls that were between like 3 and 6 or 7. And then my sister was 7, so she was in her own group, and then my brother was put in a room with boys. He was 9, and every one of us had abusers that were handling us kids. I mean, I don't even want to go into the details of what was done to my brother, the rapes, the beatings at 9 years old. Like, it wasn't, you got put straight in it. And so my mom's in a whole nother section in her mind, which is now completely broken down. She's thinking, oh, my kids are being cared for by a caretaker, see, while she gets treatment. So when your mind is so dissected, you can't think to try to like reason the reality that's going on around you. In fact, I think sometimes it's so horrific, you reason the other way.
Mhm.
You reason why, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I actually, the first 4 years of my life in the cult, my mom never touched me once. She didn't even hug me. I wasn't allowed to talk with her, to look at her in the dining room. If I was caught looking at my mother, I could get slapped across the face. You just know right away you're in compliance. And so a lot of conversation would happen with my sister. We would meet eyes and we just had the thing, where she would do like that, like don't look at me. And I write about that in the book too. So we didn't even, my mom had to sit at a table that was called the fat table. And it was her and like about five other women. And then also at that table was a woman who was exceedingly thin. I think maybe she had anorexia, and they would give her piles and piles of food and make her eat it. So you've got all these overweight women being starved, watching a skinny woman being forced to eat tons of food. I could sit and tell examples of this all day long. And then also on top of that, they're working too. So you're just kept so busy at all times. Think about Scientology. They keep their brains busy.
Yes.
And you can't think when your brain is constantly busy. And that's a purposeful thing. That's mind control, right?
And just hearing these stories, it's it's stupid for me listening that these people, that they are beating children with the thought that they are beating the beast or the demon out of you, when the truth is their actions are
They are the
so,
demon.
they are those actions to do that to an innocent child who had done nothing to them.
Hmm.
And I get angry, and I that's why I do this podcast, because I think that the,
Yeah.
the truth needs to be told. uh, that is a very dark uh
Yeah.
thing that you shared. So, thank you for having that courage
Thank
um to come out and write a book, and to express what you've been through, to share what you've been through. But through those dark times, and you were a child, where was your mind? Like, were you thinking, yes, I do deserve this? Like, were you totally, like you said your mother, her mind was dissected. Was your mind as dissected as your mother's, or do you think that you had a little bit more room growing up, at least in your case?
Well, when I was at Ware, so those 4 years between 3 years old and seven, I only have very limited memories because the torture was so bad. I'm just in complete traumatic amnesia in those blank spots, which I'm sure just filled with more and more abuse. So, how much more do I need to remember? It's just more of the same torture. When I got a little bit older and we moved to Alaska, see, now I'm seven, and seven is when a child starts to get into the age of reason, is at that age. But the fear, the fear of being hit, being caught, being in trouble, that dominated my thoughts always. So that dominates you. Um, like I could never learn how to speak in tongues. So I thought, well, God just doesn't like me. I'm not good enough. I'm like eight, thinking, watching people, shalom, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I can't do it. I look back now and I think I had a fairly strong mind in that moment, that my mind wasn't allowing itself to be programmed with that, whatever that is.
Yeah.
But I certainly blamed myself. I remember when I was 12, they call for you, like, do you want to get baptized? Do you want to like wash your sins away? And so I write in my book that I decided to go up and volunteer to be baptized, because like maybe then I was a very loud child because I was born deaf in my right ear. I don't have any hearing, but nobody ever considered that or probably even knew it. And so I was often in trouble for being boisterous. And I often felt like nobody really liked me. So I thought, well, maybe if I get baptized, like then people will like me. Like, oh, she's washed anew. And I just remember then when I went into the water, I was terrified. I don't know why, but suddenly my mind was convinced that the baptizer was going to kill me. So I went through that little tiny thought process. And then I came back up out of the water and I was like, okay. And then I go back to the shore and the next person's going in to get baptized. And I'm squeaking back to the cabin with my sopping wet jeans and skirt. And because we had to wear a skirt all the time, if we had jeans on, if it was cold, a skirt had to be over it. And I just thought in my head, like, baptism doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't wash you clean. It doesn't take your sins. It's just wet, muddy shoes squeaking a path back to the cabin. So it's just always moments like that, just disappointment and let down. And I'm not good enough. Maybe I am this, maybe I am that, maybe I am a bad kid. So your mind's just constantly in a role, meanwhile, having to work, churning butter all day long. I don't know if you've ever churned butter.
No.
You're like this all day and you're a little kid. And after hour like 3, your arms are just burning. You can't stop. You're going to get hit or in trouble. And so I was telling a friend the other day, one of the worst painful things I remember with work was, and they had these old school yokes that you see kind of like you see in a lot of slave pictures, the
Mm.
wooden yokes, and they have these hooks. We were hauling like big buckets of water and potatoes at 8, 9 years old. That's like 100 pounds on your shoulders. So, like the physical pain also of the work that we had to do at these young ages was just beyond what any child should have to ever go through.
So as all of this abuse is going, it what caught my attention right now is when you mentioned the baptism, because you were saying that what is taught is, these waters will wash away your sins.
Mm,
You're cleansed. But what caught my attention is if that's the case, you get baptized and you're clean, that beast is removed or whatever, then what's the point of all the beatings? What's the point of all of that abuse that they're doing if
mm,
supposedly these waters are going to cleanse you? And I'm thinking sometimes abusers, they justify their abuse. They use scriptures.
yeah,
Um, was there at any point justice inside the compound for the victims?
no way. No,
Was there
no.
ever an awakening? Hey, this is wrong.
It still exists today. The compound I grew up in Alaska is still thriving today. No. Even just a few years ago, a friend of mine, another fellow survivor, she ended up marrying a gentleman that I grew up with. And then they ended up getting divorced, and she was talking to his mother and asking his mother, "Do you remember me?" And she's like, "Yeah, I remember, I remember." And she said, "Well, she's got sexually molested too." And the woman said this, "Oh, you don't know her. She was a very seductive child." And my friend said, that doesn't exist. There's never a seductive child. There's only a sick, perverted adult who
Mhm.
sees a child as seductive. Oh, no, 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 no. You didn't know her as a kid. That is the mentality you're dealing with. They truly believe that a child has the ability to seduce a man. So if a child is molested and they get caught, it's the child's fault, not and they would just transfer the pedophile to another compound. So that when you're dealing with that belief, you can never have justice.
And as you're sharing that, I'm looking at the back at the book, Cult Child. of all that that girl went through. Um, so yeah, that's a very sad reality. But I see you here today. You're carrying yourself with your head high, and you've, write books. You even do, I believe you do poetry, or I see on Twitter you
Yeah,
have all these things going on.
love poetry. I mean poetry, we weren't allowed to be creative, but I was a creative little girl and I loved to write. So I would have my own little I would make little journals if you could get scraps of paper and fold them, and then you take a piece of yarn and you make a little book. And then I would write little things like I'm mad or something like that, and then like hide it in the trees. Another thing I would do is I would write something on like a piece of paper and then I would chew it like gum, right in like someone's face. And it's just like that's the justice you can get is the silent revenge was like, ha ha, I wrote something I wanted to write and I'm chewing it in your face. It was that type of, but I always loved poetry. I really think poetry is a really good way for people to begin a journey of discovering their emotions because it's so free form and it doesn't tie you to like writing. You can write a haiku of just a few lines and get it out.
Mhm.
So that's always been, yeah, I'm very appreciative that that I have that ability because I do really do write to live.
As a child, did you ever imagine that one day you would write a book where
No, I mean, it never crossed my mind. I never thought we were children who were never asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? That was, you were gonna probably marry someone in the cult and have kids. I mean, that's your ultimate goal as a girl is to get 18 and then walk out a year, which is a whole nother thing they make you do is like you walk out a year and you have a chaperone. You're not allowed to touch each other or anything until the wedding. But I mean, that was like that's it. That's what I was going to do. I was already on the prowl for a husband at 12 years old. Who's going to be my husband?
at 12?
No 12-year-old should think like that. You see what I mean? Like I have granddaughters. It doesn't even cross their mind. Like I'm now able to see how young girls grow up like firsthand because I have 8 grandchildren and a lot of them are girls. And to be able to see girls grow up in a healthy home with both parents protected, I see the reality of how little girls really actually do think at that age when they're in a health and I like thought, oh my God, I was thinking like a 20-year-old because I'd been so molested. So that's what happens in your mind. And then also, though, I had another plan because my brother ran away. So that was also there too. Like, I'm either going to do this or this. I knew when I was 18 that I could run away, but, and I knew that my grandmother was in Tennessee. But there again, you don't make a plan because you can't critically think. Like, I never thought, okay, so you run off the compound. Well, what's your grandma's phone number?
Yeah. Mhm.
You don't think about that though. You're just like, I'm going to run away and I'll get to my grandma's, or I'll meet a nice man and I'll marry him. Like one of those things is going to happen, and you just don't think of the details.
Wow. So when you left, you ran away?
My no, my brother ran away.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is, like in your mind, by the time you're reaching puberty, when you're on a cult like that, where most of the kids are molested, and then as the kids get older, and this is another thing I think is horrific, is as the kids get older, sometimes they kind of have to make a choice. Do I continue being abused or do I become an abuser? So there were older teenage boys who were abusive too, and girls. But you understand the culture that's around you. And when my brother ran away is the first time I understood, like, oh, but it's scary. You're miles and miles back in the tundra. There's bears. There's like, it's a scary thing to think about. if you make it to Richardson Highway, you've got another hour and a half to get to Delta Junction, which is completely run by the cult. And from there, it's another hour and a half to Fairbanks. And then finally, you're in a big city. So it's not just like a 10-minute run away and you're up. It's like a lot you have to think about. And so there's that, or there's getting married. Who am I gonna walk my year out with? And then you had to do like I know there was one couple, they had to kind of trick to get together because sometimes they'll screw with your head and go, no, God, this is not the pairing that God, this is not God's calling. And so now they're separating two people who are truly in love and breaking their hearts. So I know sometimes they would kind of trick and say, oh, I want to be with someone else, hoping that the elders, that sadistic elder would go, no, you need to be with this guy. And now you're like, okay, and you've got the guy you want. It's just so twisted.
They have that much control.
Oh, yeah.
So now for this part of the interview, we've spoken about how life is like for the cult child. I want to focus on what is it like outside the cult for you, and what did the healing process look like, and what were like the first steps of that journey for you?
Well, leaving the cold, life was extremely loud and overwhelming and busy and huge and big and just like the only place I excelled as far as education went was like reading, English ability, writing ability, because that's all I could do on the cult. And I'd read the whole Bible like 4 times by the time I was 14, including like memorizing long, like the begets and stuff like that. Um, but I just spent a lot of my years just kind of faking it until you can learn and watching and kind of hanging back and trying to figure. I mean, to this day, I'm 55. Just the other night, I went to a function and I felt so effing awkward. In my head, I felt awkward, like I did not belong there. They program into you that feeling that you don't belong. And it always pops up in some moment or another. And then you have to kind of go, no, you do belong here and you are worthy of being here, and go away. That you don't get to talk to me like that anymore. But I don't know if you ever reach a place where that never exists again. I think for me is just like learning how to process it when it arrives. But I mean, I live my life kind of tailored towards my impairments. Like I don't do loud places or work in loud environments with tons of people. And I mean, there's certain things I need because I'll deal with migraines, I'll deal with nausea, I'll deal with depression, I'll deal with just certain things. It's I'm very passionate about this with because so many people have mental health issues that employers are more kind and offer more support, because coming out of a cold and trying to acclimate even to the work world, even to college, like I went to college, but it was weird and confusing. And the first time I ever learned that this country owned slaves, I never learned that in the cold. I was completely missing large chunks of history. So I was just this flopping fish out of water. And I gravitated towards poor kids, like we all hung together and we lived in a trailer park. My mother was very poor. Um, and I was just confused about the world. I didn't understand it. And it took years and years and years and years. There's still, like I said, there's still things I'm like, wait, I don't quite get that. But
Yeah.
now, see, I'll go, wait, I don't understand that. Will you explain what you mean? Whereas, I mean, I think that's part of the healing is that
Yeah.
you're able to say that without shame. Like, I don't get that. I don't get the joke, and then someone might go, oh, that's based on a show in the 70s. And then you're like, oh, yeah, well, I was on a cult.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't get that joke. There are moments like that almost every day. when you grow up like that that you have, because you've missed almost two whole eras of the world: history, global economics, politics, TV, media, everything that little kids get to grow up and watch, cartoons, stuff like that. So, yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that it's like an end times cult, and
Mhm.
that your father made, was it ships or planes? Planes, right?
And my dad retired from the Navy, and then
Okay.
he was part of the Northrop Grumman crew, and they all came back together. They all retired. He retired in '69, which is the year I was born. They all came back together, and they designed the F-14 Tomcat, which is one of our, I don't know if it's still in exist. I mean, I don't know if they still use it, but at that time it was, a bomber. So my father was an aerospace engineer, so a very brilliant man. Um, I think a lot of military guys lost their families to cults during that time.
And I bring that up because they used your father as an example of the evil of the world, the darkness of the
Yeah.
world, to kind of,
Mhm.
well, especially for your mother to dissect the brain. And but upon leaving, did all of that indoctrination, did it bother you outside when dealing with worldly affairs? Or if it did, how did you kind of maneuver through that?
Yeah, definitely did, because one memory that really stands out to me is that movie, the original Red Dawn movie with Patrick Swayze, and the Cubans come and the Russians come, because they drove the Russians home to us on the Colt, like big time. We did drills prepared for the Russians to come, and they were all communists, and they were going to kill every Christian in America. And so we literally did drills where we had 50-pound backpacks hiking up into the mountains, preparing for when the Russians came. And when I saw that movie, it scared me so bad. I mean, I can remember really like having deep fear. I was like, wait a minute. So my mind couldn't reason that they were taking things from the world and using it.
Mhm.
In my mind, oh, wait a minute, like they predicted this, because I didn't have anything to balance it by. So I had a lot of those moments. But first, I had to do things like learn to use electricity, and learn how to use a stove, and learn how to do just little small things just within the household that I wasn't used to. How do I use appliances? How do I use the television? How does the telephone work? How do I count change? How do I get groceries at the grocery store? So just all of that I had to go through in the beginning. And then you add media on top of that, and a movie like Red Dawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very much moments. And there were even moments I missed sometimes the quiet, because this is something I think is very hard for like people who've never been abused or been in cults to understand, is that you're not always having active memory. I didn't have the language to say I've been abused. I didn't have that understanding. I don't even remember thinking about it. I think the mind, it's so terrible. The mind just really pushes it down as far as it can go, knowing that I couldn't have handled those memories as a 15-year-old child. I probably, who knows what it would have done to my mind if I remembered what was done to me as a 5-year-old, right? So I didn't think about it. We just kind of were like going through the world, like, okay, this is the part of the river we're on now. And that's how I moved through life. And then I got pregnant with my oldest son, and I was 19. And he gave me, I tell him this, I'm like, dude, you saved me, because it gave me like a purpose. And I said, okay, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to go to college now. And so I did that, and I had him, and I went to college, and just floated. I didn't really start really looking at the abuse until I was like 38. A lot of memories started popping up, especially after my mom died in 2008. Something about her passing really cracked my brain open. So I'm still have memories. that pop up every now and then. I just had one the other day. I just don't think it ever ends,
Yeah.
especially when you have so many suppressed, when you're dealing with traumatic amnesia like that. And then the memories you do have are so horrific that you're kind of like, ugh, like if this is what I have, what happened in the places my mind isn't giving me yet. So yeah, there was a lot of that. And then I just focused on my kids and I worked and I was, a single mom for a long time. And um, then they grew up too. All of that kind of converged where they grew up, my mother died, and I'm like, now it's just me and my brain and my mental health. And what do I do now? I guess I got to face this shit. Let's
Mhm.
go in. I mean, that's why I wrote really was to see how much I could get out. So, and then I found my other survivors. That was really mind blowing. When I found, because my mind didn't remember like so much. And this will give you an example. I found one gal who grew up with me in Alaska. She was my sister's friend, and I don't remember her. I have stared at her face trying to just bring up one memory. And she was like, I'd be at your cabin all the time. I remember so much about you. She's telling me memories that I don't remember. So that's the brain, and you're learning to kind of work with that, and you're learning not to dissociate and all those things that happen, and trying to find the glimmers instead of the triggers, and try to latch onto those.
Well, it
So,
it truly is a journey, and
mhm.
for me personally, I think it was very scary to take that first step of acknowledging that there was abuse. And you've also mentioned that there's no language to express that this was abuse. It, actually, I always thought in the beginning that if anything, it was a deserved discipline, that it was a justified thing. And then later on, as I'm reading material from people like Yanya Lalich and memoirs from other survivors, it really
Yeah,
builds the courage for survivors, reading other survivors material, like reading your material, that okay, this is really dark stuff and it's okay to acknowledge. And once I started to acknowledge, I think that's when I was able to start my own healing journey. And then
yeah,
we have this podcast. And you've also shared the beauty of poetry, how that expressing, you can find the words to, get it just right. But I see also in the background, for those who are watching on the Spotify video or on the YouTube, if you look at the background, there are some artistic things. Has it been has it been helpful in your healing journey? And if so, how?
okay, so I do want to say this piece and this piece here are actually done by a fellow survivor named Sheila Burton. She painted those for me and I just really cherish them. It's funny because I made a lot of art when I was writing Cult Child, and I kind of make art in spurts. I think what happens is when I'm writing difficult things, my body gives me these outlets. Like I wrote songs when I was writing Cult Child too, but I haven't written any songs since. So I feel like um somehow the brain gives you this place to put the pain because it's just too much for the mind to handle. Um, so it's been a minute since, well, I also really got into digital art and I love like collage work. And so I moved a little bit into that medium because I love the idea of taking elements and pieces. And then I've been into AI art because I'm a writer and I have put my poems into Dolly, for instance, on Chat GPT, and just to see what kind of images they produce. So I'm still do art, but I love that we can now take
Yeah.
writing and art. I'm like, oh, so I am still, but I would like to get back to like that physical artistic style. There's a painting that I've been working on since 2013. It's a near death experience image. So I'm like, I am determined to finish that painting this year, like like 11 years later. So I don't know what that is, but yeah, it's an interesting process, the creative flow. But poetry, uh, the other book is Keeper of Backwards Men. I published that last year, June of 2023. That's a compilation of just like 30 years of writing that I throughout the COVID period and after my brother passed, I just started organizing um and pulling that together. And then I also have a poetry writing group on Patreon. It's $5 a month and we do poetry writing off of prompts. I think it's a great way if anybody wants to write a poetry book to like create the poems for that book. And then the money that we make off of it, we pour back in. Like right now, we have a writing competition going on with $100 cash prize and then two $50 cash prizes. So I love
Ooh.
that process too of helping other writers like break out, especially if they've never written poetry. I love that because I think poetry is the most connective. Poetry and art connects you the deepest, I think, to your emotions.
And it's a very healthy outlet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
So
it,
I do keep my brain busy, Ryan. I do.
I love that.
Yeah. And I have to watch that I'm not avoiding, right? To where I keep my brain busy because there's like something maybe I don't want to face. So I'm trying to be self-aware. It's taken me a lot of gratitude practice, a lot of learning to sit still with myself in meditation. That's hard for a trauma survivor when you first start because all the memories are right there. So but now, I mean, years and years and years, that's a practice breathing, just breathing it out, all the little things that we do because we grow up with our nervous systems like
Yeah.
this. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to unwind it. And we didn't even like someone did it to us, so it can be sad on days, as you know, and the emotions can blindside you. That's another thing too. So many survivors, they want to work on their trauma, but they also have to manage their lives. They have to go to work and they have to take care of their children. And the process of facing trauma is so painful and so excruciating. You can wake up on days crying where you can't stop. How are you supposed to go to work on a day like that? You need a boss that you can call and go, dude, or ma'am, I'm having this day. Can't
Mhm.
stop crying. And they go, it's okay. Take care of you today. Call me in the morning. We need more mindfulness like that. And I think that will then inspire people to work on their trauma, so that their body's not holding it. The Body Keeps the Score is another one of my favorite books. It just opened my mind up in so many ways of how our physical body holds on to that trauma as well. So the healing journey is complex and deep, but it's so much better than sitting in the quicksand and just slowly drowning.
So thank you for sharing all about, your personal experiences in that dark past and how right now your life is full of writings, creativity, and it looks like there's also another book coming in the near future.
There is. I just put out a little teaser today. So I'm writing my first work of science fiction. It's an SV Novum book. So the genre of SV Novum takes science fiction and real science and lets it dance together. So without telling anybody the plot, you can go to X or go to my YouTube channel. If you just, or even my website, it's on my homepage as well. You can watch the teaser and get just a little taste of what I'm writing. But I'm excited and I hope hoping to do the a soft launch sometime next year, but it's got to be perfect. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Benny. It's been
Thank
an honor
you.
to have you on the Truth That Heals podcast. And I'm going to leave the links below for the audience, those who are listening. I'm going to leave links below so you can follow her on social media or on her website, as well as her Patreon to get involved. I think it's a very creative and helpful way. And again, Venny, thank you so much for being
Thank
here
you.
on the Truth That Heals podcast.
We finally did it.
We did it.
Yeah.